The day was bright, but tense as the human walked through the gates of the firing range with the cubs trailing close behind. Their small steps were unsure, their ears twitching at the unfamiliar echoes of metal clashing and voices shouting in the distance. For them, this place was strange, filled with sharp scents of gunpowder and oil and the heavy thud of boots on the ground. The human had not brought them here to fight or to frighten them, but to show them something they could carry with them for life: discipline, focus, and the strength to stay calm even in chaos. As the first shot cracked across the field, the cubs froze. The sound was so loud it rattled in their chests like thunder crashing far too close. Their eyes darted to the human, searching for any sign of fear, but he stood steady, his posture strong, his gaze forward. That quiet strength calmed them more than words could have. They shuffled closer, pressing near his side, their young hearts beating fast, but their trust anchoring them. One of the cubs tilted its head, watching how the human's hands moved carefully, checking equipment, standing tall, showing that every action had purpose. Another cub crouched low, ready to bolt at the next thunderous crack, but the human's calm presence made running feel unnecessary. Even in the face of something unknown and frightening, they felt the pull to stay. They were not here to battle. The human's intent was clear. He wanted them to learn that noise and chaos do not always mean danger, and that true strength was not in loudness, but in control. The range buzzed with energy. Others trained, some shouted commands, while the rifles cracked again and again. But for the cubs, the entire world had shrunk to the steady figure they followed. The smell of smoke drifted through the air as another round went off, and the cubs flinched again. Their instincts screamed to hide, but their loyalty made them hold their ground. Slowly, curiosity replaced fear. They began to notice the rhythm of things, the way shooters prepared, the way the target stood far away yet fell with precision, the way order ruled over the chaos. They looked back at the human, who never wavered, and realized that perhaps there was nothing to fear if he was standing tall. Protective by nature, the cubs shifted closer in a circle around him, as though to shield him, even though they were the smaller, weaker ones. It was their way of showing that no matter how loud the world became, they would not leave his side. By the time the session stretched on, the cubs were no longer trembling at every sound. The cracks of gunfire still startled them, but less and less with each passing moment. What had begun as fear was slowly reshaping into focus, and the lesson the human had hoped to plant was taking root. It wasn't about weapons or the sharp echo of bullets. It was about standing steady in a storm, trusting yourself and those beside you. For the cubs, it was the first step into a bigger world. And for the human, it was proof that even the youngest hearts could learn the meaning of discipline when guided by trust. The air at the range was already heavy with the sharp scent of gunpowder when the rangemaster's deep voice suddenly cut across the field. His call for a lockdown drill was firm, sharp, and carried authority that demanded instant obedience. The human understood the meaning immediately and straightened, moving with precision, but the cubs froze in their tracks. Their wide eyes darted from the rangemaster to the human, unsure if danger had suddenly come crashing down on them. The word lockdown was unfamiliar, and to their young minds it carried the weight of alarm. For a brief moment, the crack of rifles and the chatter of soldiers seemed to fade, replaced by the pounding of their own hearts. The cubs huddled together, their tails stiff, their paws uncertain, waiting for a sign of what to do. The rangemaster's gaze fell on them, stern yet calm, and he motioned firmly for silence and stillness. Around them, the range shifted into order. Shooters stepped back, rifles were secured, and voices hushed into a low murmur. The cubs did not understand the routine, but they could sense that this was something serious. Their first instinct was to look at the human, and what they saw gave them direction. He didn't panic, didn't flinch, and didn't show fear. Instead, he crouched slightly to their level, his eyes steady, his movements clear. He lifted his hand, signaling for them to stay close and watch. That single gesture carried more comfort than 100 words could have. Slowly, the cubs began to steady their breathing, though their bodies remained tense. The lockdown was not a threat but a drill, a practice to ensure safety. Yet the cubs couldn't know that. All they could see was the sudden shift in atmosphere, the weight of silence that pressed down after the command. It felt like the entire range was holding its breath. The smallest cub pressed against the human's leg, trembling, while the others formed a loose circle, protective even in their confusion. It was not courage born of understanding, but of loyalty. They didn't know what was happening, but they would not leave his side. The range master, noticing their fear, softened his stance for just a moment. His voice, though still strong, carried patience as he explained that this was not danger, but training. He spoke so that even the cubs could hear. A lockdown was not meant to frighten, but to prepare, to remind everyone that safety always comes first. The cubs didn't fully grasp the words, but the tone and calm presence eased some of their fear. They watched as the human moved exactly as instructed, every step deliberate and respectful of the order given. It showed them that discipline was not weakness, but strength, the ability to stay steady even when your heart was pounding. By the end of the drill, the cubs were still uncertain, but something inside them had shifted. They had faced a moment of confusion and fear, yet they did not scatter. They had stayed with the human, had listened, had watched, and had begun to learn the meaning of trust in structure. The rangemaster gave a nod of approval not just to the human, but to the cubs as well. For their first drill, they had held their ground. It was a small victory, invisible to many, but to the human, it was a sign that even in fear, the cubs were beginning to grow into something stronger. The firing line roared with sound as rifles cracked one after another, the echo bouncing off the walls and rolling across the open space like thunder. The human stood in his place, shoulders square, posture calm, and movement steady, as though the chaos of noise around him meant nothing. To those watching from afar, he looked perfectly in control, the image of discipline that the range master expected. But the cubs, gathered a short distance away, saw something that no one else seemed to notice. His ears were bare. He had forgotten to put on his ear protection. At first they thought it was nothing, just another detail like the weight of his vest, or the way he gripped his weapon. But as the cracks grew sharper, louder, and faster, they noticed him flinch ever so slightly. It was subtle, hidden behind his calm expression, but to the cubs, it was as clear as the sun in the sky. Their protector, their guide, the one who always seemed unshakable, was standing in the storm without shelter. The smallest cub tilted his head, confused, and pressed closer to the others. They exchanged uncertain looks, their ears twitching at each deafening shot. They could barely stand the noise themselves, even with their natural senses. How much worse must it be for the human who had no shield at all? The thought stirred something inside them, not fear this time, but urgency. He had always stood for them, always carried himself in a way that made them believe they were safe. Now, for the first time, they saw him exposed. And though the drill was not dangerous in the way battles were, it felt like danger to them. The human's calm was admirable, but the cubs could see past it. His silence was strong, but strength did not mean he should suffer alone. One of the older cubs took a hesitant step forward, then another. The others followed, forming a line as if moving together gave them courage. Their paws tapped lightly against the floor, but their eyes never left the human. Around them, the range continued its rhythm of sound and order, but to the cubs, the world had narrowed to a single point. The man at the line, standing still under a storm of noise he had no protection against. They remembered how he had guided them when fear took hold, how a single whistle or gesture had been enough to give them courage. Now, without words, they knew it was their turn. One cub darted toward the small supply table at the side of the range, clumsy but determined. He grabbed the bright orange ear protectors that had been left there, the size awkward in his mouth, but he held them tightly as if they were treasure. With hurried steps, he trotted back to the line, his siblings close behind as if escorting him. Together they pushed forward until they reached the human's side, nudging the gear against his leg. He glanced down, surprise flickering across his face, and in that moment, he understood what they had seen. His calm had fooled the others, but not the cubs. They had recognized his need and moved without hesitation. The human knelt briefly, his eyes softening as he took the ear protectors from their paws. He placed them on, and the noise dulled at once, the sharp pain fading into muted rhythm. Relief spread across his features, though he tried to hide it, and he gave the cubs a small nod of gratitude. The range master, watching from a distance, said nothing, but a faint smile touched his stern expression. The cubs had not only noticed what others ignored, but they had acted, guided by loyalty stronger than fear. It was not just obedience they were learning at the range, it was awareness, care, and the instinct to protect the one who had always protected them. The cubs stood close together, their ears twitching at each sharp crack of gunfire, their eyes fixed on the human at the line. His calm presence had always been their strength, but now, as they watched the muscles in his jaw tighten ever so slightly, they knew something was wrong. They didn't need to speak. A single look passed between them, and it was enough. Their bond had grown so deep that words had become unnecessary. Each cub understood what needed to be done, and in that instant, they divided the task without hesitation. One cub, the quickest and smallest, broke away from the group, paws light against the ground as he darted toward the supply box near the side wall. The others didn't move. They stayed rooted where they were, eyes sharp, keeping watch on the human as though their gaze alone could shield him. The cub racing toward the supply box felt the weight of urgency pressing against him. The air was thick with smoke and the echo of gunfire, and for a moment the sound was almost overwhelming. Yet he didn't falter. In his heart there was only one thought. The human needed them. His siblings kept their eyes on the human's face, watching every small flicker of discomfort he tried to hide. They knew he wouldn't admit weakness. Not here, not now, but they also knew he didn't have to. That was the unspoken promise between them. They would see what others overlooked, and they would act. At the supply box, the young cub skidded to a stop, claws scraping slightly as he tried to grip the smooth floor. His nose brushed against the edge of the box, and he pawed at it until the lid gave way with a faint creak. Inside, among tools and spare items, were the bright orange ear protectors. He grabbed them clumsily, the size awkward in his jaws, but he held on tightly as though they were the most precious thing he had ever carried. His eyes gleamed with determination as he turned back, running with all the strength in his small body. The cubs, standing guard, lifted their heads slightly when they saw him return. Their bodies shifted together, a silent line of protection as the runner moved past them toward the human. Their glances carried more than concern. They carried trust. They had moved as one without needing a plan, each knowing their role, each placing the human above everything else. When the cub reached him, panting but proud, he nudged the ear protectors against the human's leg. The human looked down, surprise flickering in his calm expression. For a moment, he simply stared, the noise of the range fading into the background as he understood what had just happened. He hadn't asked for help, yet they had seen what he needed. He hadn't spoken, but they had answered. As he bent down to take the protectors, his eyes met theirs, and in that quiet exchange, gratitude filled the space louder than the gunfire ever could. The command of the range master had been clear. Everyone was to stay still, every movement calculated, every reaction controlled. Yet the cubs, bound by something stronger than orders, could not remain frozen. The moment they realized the human had no protection against the punishing cracks of gunfire, their paws moved before their minds could question. In unison, they broke formation. Their small bodies leapt forward, scattering across the training hall, their claws tapping against the hard floor in a rhythm louder than the range master's voice. Gasps echoed from the onlookers as discipline was shattered. But the cubs didn't care. The bond they shared with the human was more powerful than any command. The room grew tense, silence hanging between the sharp cracks of gunfire. Even those who had been busy at their own stations paused, eyes following the cubs' daring dash. They weren't running wildly, they had purpose, clear and urgent. One cub reached the supply shelf first, pawing at the container until it toppled slightly, spilling a few earplugs onto the floor. With surprising precision, he snatched one set in his jaws and turned back, his tail lashing with determination. Behind him, another cub darted forward, grabbing another pair, as if to make certain the human would not be without protection again. The range master's sharp calls cut through the air, his voice filled with authority, demanding they stop, demanding they return. Yet the cubs didn't so much as glance his way. Their ears flicked back at the sound, but their eyes never left the human. They had chosen in that moment who they would obey, not rules written on paper, but the silent trust that bound them to the human. As they sprinted back, their small bodies seemed to blur with speed, cutting through the tense air of the firing range. Every step carried defiance against the order of stillness, every breath fueled by loyalty. When they reached the human, they didn't stop to rest or explain. Instead, they pushed the earplugs against his hands and legs, their eyes wide with urgency. Their message was clear. Protect yourself, because your safety matters more than anything else. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. The range master stood rigid, torn between discipline and disbelief, watching cubs disobey his direct command for the sake of one man. Those around them exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of it, but the human understood. His eyes softened as he accepted the earplugs, his hands brushing the cub's fur in silent thanks. In that single act, the cubs had broken rules, silenced authority, and ignored fear. Yet they had also shown something the drills could never teach: loyalty that moved faster than thought, love that outweighed orders, and courage that turned disobedience into honor. The room may have been filled with silence, but in that silence, a lesson echoed louder than any command. The sharp call of the range master froze in his throat as his raised hand cut through the air, demanding order, demanding silence. But something unusual happened before his voice could take full control. The cubs had already reached the human, their small paws pressing the bright orange earplugs into his open hands. The human looked down, surprised, his calm broken for the first time as he realized what they had noticed before anyone else. For a moment, the only sound in the hall was the soft scuff of the cubs' claws against the floor, the echo of their daring charge still hanging in the air. The loud cracks of gunfire that had filled the range moments before seemed to fade into the background, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Those who had been watching forgot about the lockdown drill, their strict focus on safety shifting to curiosity and wonder. The range master, known for his unshakable authority, found himself hesitating, his stern eyes narrowing as he studied the scene in front of him. He was used to immediate obedience, to rules being followed without question, but the cubs' disobedience wasn't wild or careless. It was deliberate, filled with purpose. They had broken formation not to play, not to disrupt, but to protect. The human stood still, earplugs resting against his palm, his gaze softening as he looked at the cubs circling him with nervous eyes, as though asking if he was safe now. The silence grew heavier, yet it wasn't uncomfortable. It carried weight, a kind of respect that no command could summon. Even those who had been ready to scold or lecture bit back their words. They could see the truth too clearly. The cubs had noticed what others missed, and their instincts had driven them to act faster than reason. The range master lowered his hand slowly, his lips pressed into a thin line as though debating whether to reprimand them or to let the moment stand as it was. In the end, he said nothing, for words seemed unnecessary. The cubs pressed closer to the human, their tails brushing against his legs, their eyes flicking between him and the earplugs as if urging him to put them on immediately. Their small bodies trembled, not from fear of punishment, but from the lingering echoes of the gunfire that had threatened the one they trusted most. The human, touched by their loyalty, slid the earplugs into place, nodding gently in acknowledgement. His hand brushed over their heads, a gesture of gratitude that spoke louder than words. And in that moment, the range transformed. It was no longer about drills, commands, or discipline. It was about a bond stronger than rules, about loyalty that silenced authority, and about courage that reminded everyone present of what true protection really meant. The strictest voices fell quiet, not out of fear, but out of respect. The cubs had spoken without speaking, and their message rang louder than any gunshot. The human stood at the firing line, earplugs finally resting in place, but his focus was no longer on the targets ahead. Instead, his eyes dropped to the cubs gathered tightly around his legs, their small chests rising and falling quickly from the rush of what they had just done. For a long moment, he did not speak. He simply let the weight of the scene sink into his heart. They had defied the Rangemaster, ignored the rules of discipline, and risked harsh punishment, all for one reason: to make sure he was safe. It wasn't instinct alone. It was loyalty, deep and unshaken. His throat tightened as he realized how different their priorities were compared to the others at the range. While the rest followed orders with their eyes fixed forward, the cubs had chosen him first, proving that their bond was stronger than fear. He remembered the glance they had shared before one darted off toward the supply box, and how the others stood guard as though protecting him was more important than obeying any command. That memory stirred something inside him, a quiet understanding that no amount of training could create. Loyalty like this wasn't taught, it was earned, and he wondered if he had truly done enough to deserve it. The cubs didn't look proud of what they had done. They didn't puff up their chests or wait for praise. Instead, they stared up at him with wide eyes as if asking, "Did we do right? Are you safe now?" He saw the faint tremble in their bodies, not from fear of punishment, but from the weight of their choice. And he knew his answer mattered more than anything else. Kneeling down slowly so his gaze met theirs, the human placed a hand gently on the nearest cub's head. The others pressed closer, drawn to his touch, seeking reassurance. A smile tugged at his lips, but behind it was a swell of humility. These young ones, so often dismissed as weak or unready, had just proven themselves braver than most grown warriors. They had chosen compassion over obedience, care over compliance, and in that defiance, they had shown him something far greater than discipline: the essence of loyalty. The human's chest grew heavy with a mix of gratitude and responsibility. If they were willing to break rules for him, then he needed to become someone worthy of that trust. He thought about the harshness of the world beyond the range, the countless dangers that lay ahead, and how these cubs might one day face them. He realized that their courage came not from training, but from the bond they had built with him. The bond of trust, of safety, of quiet understanding. It was a gift he could never take lightly. The silence around them stretched on, but he didn't mind. For the first time in a long while, the human felt a lesson sink into his own heart. Loyalty wasn't about words, and leadership wasn't about commands. It was about standing with each other, no matter the cost. And in that moment, humbled by the small figures pressed against his legs, he promised himself that he would never forget the truth the cubs had shown him. Loyalty was not demanded. It was given freely. And once given, it became the most powerful bond of all. The Rangemaster had seen countless drills, hundreds of students, and more mistakes than he could remember. He was used to snapping at those who broke formation, demanding silence and keeping order with sharp discipline. But as he stood frozen in that moment, watching the cubs press earplugs into the human's hands, something inside him shifted. His mouth opened as if to scold, but no words came. Instead, his sharp eyes softened, taking in what had just happened. He had called for a lockdown drill, expecting fear, hesitation, maybe even confusion. Yet these young cubs had done something he had not predicted. They had not thought of themselves, nor had they followed his voice. Their first thought had been for the human. It wasn't rebellion for its own sake, nor was it disobedience born from pride. It was instinct, pure and simple, rooted in care. They had chosen loyalty over rules, and that, he realized, was rarer than anything training could produce. For years, he had believed that the key to strength was discipline: stand straight, obey quickly, follow without hesitation. And while those values kept order, they often erased the heart of those who followed. But here, in front of him, stood proof that heart could be stronger than order. He had seen warriors freeze under commands, waiting for orders instead of acting. Yet these cubs had acted without waiting because their bond with the human demanded it. The Rangemaster had to admit to himself, this kind of loyalty, this instinct to protect, could not be trained. It was something deeper, something that had to be earned. He let his hand fall from its raised position, signaling the others to continue the drill as if nothing had happened. But in truth, he knew things had changed. He watched the human kneeling beside the cubs, whispering soft words of comfort, and the sight struck him harder than he expected. The cubs didn't beam with pride. They simply stayed close, as if making sure the human was safe before thinking of anything else. And in that quiet closeness, the Rangemaster found a lesson for himself. Perhaps leadership wasn't just about giving orders and demanding obedience. Perhaps the strongest bond was the one that made others act out of love and trust, not fear. He felt an unfamiliar respect for the cubs, for the human, and for the bond they had built. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it carried more weight than any weapon on the range. As the echoes of gunfire returned and the drill moved forward, the Rangemaster kept his eyes on them. He did not interrupt, did not correct, did not raise his voice. Instead, he carried the scene with him like a quiet truth. What he had witnessed wasn't disorder. It was loyalty in its purest form. And though he didn't say it aloud, the respect in his silence was the highest honor he could give. The loud cracks of gunfire returned, echoing across the range, but something in the air felt different. The cubs no longer flinched as they had before, no longer looked small or lost among the sound and chaos. Instead, they stood straighter, their shoulders squared, their eyes sharper. They knew they had broken a rule, but deep inside, they also knew why they had done it, and that gave them strength. Courage was not about ignoring fear. It was about stepping through it when something more important was at stake. And for them, nothing was more important than the human who had stood with them from the very beginning. The Rangemaster glanced their way more than once, still puzzled, but no longer angry. He could see it in their posture. The cubs had grown in spirit, as if a quiet victory had taken root inside them. Their decision to act had not just protected the human, it had shown them what loyalty meant. Safety had always been taught to them as rules and drills, but now they understood it in a way no command could ever explain. To them, safety meant watching over the one who had guided them, standing firm even when the world told them to stay still. The human, too, felt the shift. He stood at the firing line again, but now he wasn't just demonstrating calmness for their sake. He felt calm because of them. He realized he wasn't alone, that even in a place built on rules and strict voices, there were hearts that cared for him more than regulations. The earplugs in his hands were small, almost ordinary, yet they carried the weight of everything the cubs had done. He slipped them in, not just for protection, but as a symbol of trust. Around them, the drill continued, the others firing as expected, but the cubs didn't blend into the crowd anymore. Their presence drew quiet glances and whispers began to pass through the group. People could see that something unusual had happened, something that spoke louder than the weapons in their hands. The cubs didn't need to boast or explain. Their courage had already been written in the silence that had fallen when they acted. Though they had broken rules, no shame touched their faces. Instead, there was a kind of quiet pride, not in themselves, but in knowing they had protected the one who mattered most. For the cubs, this was victory. Not the kind measured by targets hit or drills completed, but the kind that etched itself deep into memory. They had chosen loyalty over fear, action over hesitation, and in doing so, they discovered a strength that no amount of training could ever give. As the final shots rang out, the cubs remained steady, calm in a way they had never been before. The world might see them as young and untested, but in their hearts, they knew they had already faced something greater than fear. Their quiet victory wasn't marked by applause, but by the unspoken bond that held them together, one stronger than any rule. Long after the echo of the last shot had faded, the memory of that day remained alive, carried not only in the hearts of those who were there, but in the whispers that traveled beyond the range. People spoke of it not as another training drill or exercise, but as the day silence spoke louder than noise, the day when loyalty outshone discipline. The story spread because it was not about weapons or targets, but about a bond that refused to bend under rules or fear. The cubs, once seen as small and unsure, had shown courage that surprised even the sternest voices. They had broken formation, defied an order, and yet no one could deny the truth behind their choice. What mattered most to them was not obedience. It was the safety of the human who had stood beside them through every challenge. That act became more than just a memory. It became a lesson whispered like a legend. For the human, the memory was sharper than any command ever given. He could still feel the weight of the earplugs pressed into his hand, the urgency in the cub's eyes, and the silence that followed when everyone realized what had happened. To him, it was never about how steady his aim had been that day, nor about the noise of the firing line. It was about the hearts that had chosen him before themselves, proving a loyalty that no training manual could ever teach. That realization stayed with him not as a burden, but as a reminder that he was never truly alone. The bond between him and the cubs was not born out of drills or discipline. It was carved out of trust, care, and the instinct to protect one another. Years later, when new recruits came to the range, the story was told again and again. Some laughed in disbelief, others listened in silence, but all of them felt something shift inside. It wasn't just a tale about cubs and a human. It was about the kind of strength that grows from loyalty, the kind of courage that rises not from orders, but from love. The range itself seemed different after that day, as if the echoes of gunfire carried a softer note, one that reminded everyone of what truly mattered. The cubs had grown since then, taller and stronger, but that moment stayed etched in their hearts as well. No matter where life took them, they would always remember the day they stood up, not for glory or praise, but for the one who mattered most. It became their story, their proof that courage wasn't measured by size, age, or even strength. It was measured by the choices made when fear tried to hold them still. And so the tale lived on, retold by those who had seen it and those who believed in it. A story remembered not for weapons or drills, but for a bond unbroken, a bond louder than the fiercest shot fired.